Welcome everyone to this masterclass on cultural foresight. We hope to keep it engaging and light and fun to do as well. So feel free to bring in your comments in the chat section. We have Amy Darakakis joining us, who will be handling a little bit of that, and will be kind of our eyes on the chat as well. We appreciate that, Amy. And yeah, again, thank you so much for joining. We're really excited for this. This is the last of our series of four masterclasses me and Chloe have hosted. We went all the way from selling foresight to doing foresight, augmenting foresight, and now we thought we'd take it back to the human perspective on cultural foresight. So we've been very excited for this, and the weather is getting better, at least here in Denmark it is. So I think it's a good time to talk about sort of some of these things. Yeah, I think maybe if you can start sharing the slides and we can go through the presentation. So feel free to chip in with questions, comments, thoughts along the way. We hope for you to really be engaged in this.
We'll have a little Q&A at the end. So if you want to share your questions right away in the chat, and our friend Amy will gather them, and at the end we can ask all the questions. So let's begin.
Great. Yeah, so foresight, of course, is many things, and part of future studies, this whole big bucket of different disciplines that has to do with anticipating the futures. We decided to take a lens on cultural foresight in this instance, and you might each have a different perspective on what cultural foresight actually is. So we would also be curious to hear what you thought when you heard this combination of words, but we're going to look at it from different perspectives in this masterclass today. So we're very excited to do that in a moment. And it's good to see both some familiar faces and some new faces in this. We've been doing this for half a year now, a little bit more, and very excited to move through today. Yeah, so we'll basically go through what is cultural foresight and our understanding of it. Why does it matter that we look at culture and foresight? We're going to share some tools. We're going to have a little bit of a movement. How do you go through a process using some of these tools and methods? And finally, we're also going to talk more about the human layers of foresight. Why is it important to, have the human factor in? Because there's a lot of talk about AI and foresight. Augmenting foresight was the name of our last masterclass. So we want to make sure this is also part of that whole concept of cultural foresight and what it means. And we'll end with the takeaways and a Q&A, so you can ask any questions at the end. And since I'm already talking, I guess I can introduce myself first. My name is Matthias. I'm the founder and director of Anticipate. I'm a futurist. I've been working with Foresight now for almost a decade, first at the Copenhagen Institute of Future Studies. And my background is very much in cultural studies. That was what I studied first. I wanted to be an anthropologist. So it was very natural for me to have that lens and bring it into a futurist perspective when I started working in this field. So working on projects, everything from public to private sector, from very participatory hands-on work to doing research and strategy. So it spans quite a lens in that way. And then I have Chloe with me.
Yes, Matthias, I did know you wanted to become an anthropologist. I wanted to become a sociologist, and I also studied culture and political sciences and social sciences in Germany and Berlin a while ago, 12, 15 years ago. Yes, my name is Chloé de Ruffray, and I'm a cultural foresight practitioner. My background is more in insight and trend forecasting. I've been working with the private sector for over a decade. I started my career at an agency in Germany, then moved to Portugal and then back to France. And I've been mainly working with industries in the lifestyle sector, so luxury, beauty, wellness, sports, a bit of tech, and now my focus is really on longevity. This is why you'll see in the presentation some examples from this field applied to foresight.
Yeah, and so why culture and foresight? That's a big question. We already had a comment from Maha about, sorry for mispronouncing your name, around what does culture really mean in this context? What are we talking about when we talk about culture? And so the definition of culture is, of course, very broad. I remember this was a whole course in my undergraduate degree on what culture is and what it isn't. And it is many things and it's defined in many ways, but really the short definition is that it's the beliefs, customs, arts, the ways of doing things in a particular society, group, place, or time, right? It can both be as also goes into the second part of the definition. It can be in a company context, organizational context, a country culture, a regional one, local one, communities. There are many aspects of this, but it's really our collective ways of doing things, our behavior, our needs, our nuances, and all this. And of course, very broad, but also do with us humans being together in a certain sense and what is kind of emerging from those interactions. I think it's very important to say that culture is not something that's static, not at all. In some, some arguments from some politicians you hear, yeah, culture, we have this certain culture and we had it forever, right? But that's not how things have emerged. It's always developed in a certain way. It's just because we have kind of a poor sense of hindsight and what has happened previously.
Sorry, there are people joining.
Mhm.
Um, yes, and one thing that I wanted to add to what you just said, Matthias, is that, of course, this is one attempt to define culture. There are many things that we did not mention on this slide. This is like an ongoing conversation. Because it's not a static object, it's very difficult to exactly frame what it is. But one thing is for sure is that when we talk about culture in the context of cultural foresight or in the context of culture of foresight in general, we need to be aware of our personal cultural lens as foresight practitioner. I'm sure this will be only a reminder for a lot of you, but we tend to forget sometimes that our beliefs and life experiences and the narratives and the parts of the world we come from shape how we interpret the world and its future. And there is something that we cannot do. It's to extract ourselves from this cultural lens. It's part of our identity. It's part of how we relate to the world, of how we interact with it. But one thing that we can do to be as much as transparent as possible is to make it visible, to question it, and to question it and to be aware of it in order to avoid biased analysis. And this is very important because we all have blind spots. There is nothing wrong about that, but being aware of it is very helpful when we work with foresight and especially cultural foresight. Because otherwise, if we're not aware of it, or if we consciously decide to not deal with that, we have the risk to project our own worldview and make it sound as if it was universal. That's one aspect. And the other aspect, as foresight practitioner and with our personal cultural lens, our role is not to have a vision, but to be able to hold multiple vision at the same time in order to bring perspectives into dialogue and normalize this tension. And it's very important to consciously and regularly step out of our cultural bubble. Again, because this is how we can provide, in our opinion, a better work and also improve ourselves as a practitioner, but also, of course, as human beings.
Yeah, and I teased for this image a little bit in one of my LinkedIn posts leading up to this masterclass. I use it all the time because I still think it's a great example. I haven't grown tired of using it in that sense, but this is depicting from the 50s, 1950s in the US, depicting the world in the 2000s, how it might look, right? So it's a kind of an image of the futures in or the one future you might say. And as you might notice, there are things here that are kind of quite interesting of things they predicted right. If you might talk about prediction in this context, we have quite advanced technology from the flat screen TV to even the a fancy oven. We have the iPad tablet where you can talk with your friends across the world and so on. There are also certain things of technology they didn't maybe get completely right. The personal helicopter is not something we've seen yet. And it might be also, there are always these things that we have thought we would live in the skies for many years. I think that's kind of the next barrier for many to break in that sense, but it hasn't really happened due to certain things, right? But if you might notice, some of the things that have been difficult for them to kind of get right in that sense have been some of the cultural elements, the norms, the roles, the kind of the societal trends that have happened over time, right? For example, the grandfather smoking in front of children, the very thin waistlines for an American living in the 2000s, you might also say. Now there's Ozempic, and it might help a little bit, and also something about the classic American gender roles that have really been brought from the 50s to the future and not been rethought. Or maybe, this is still the case in some homes, right? But it hasn't really like permeated culture in essence. So it's very, very difficult to do these things, and especially if we don't try, if we don't look at how technology can liberate certain people from certain tasks and move us into other parts of society, looking at our needs and conveniences and how it drives how we do things, right? So just a little bit of an example. Yeah, the aging is very cultural in essence as well. You live multiple generations under the same roof. And it still happens in some countries, maybe not in the US. So just a little image to show that, culture can be difficult to kind of project in the right way.
But it's not because it's difficult that we should not try.
No,
That's
that's an important statement. So that's also why we would love to go into what is cultural foresight actually.
yeah. What is it? That's I mean, we it took us a while to land on something that we really agreed on. So it's still an ongoing process, and we are very much open to hear your feedback and maybe, your ideas on how we could make this definition a bit more sophisticated or nuanced, whatever your opinion is. But just as a reminder, when we talk about strategic foresight, we're talking about ways to anticipating the future to better prepare for it. Oops, sorry. No. Okay. I'm just gonna to better prepare today. So this is like the generic definition of strategic foresight. And when we talk about cultural foresight, it's actually the application of certain foresight method through a cultural lens through the entire process. So we're looking at shifts in, as Matthias was just mentioning, behaviors, values, narratives to make sense of signals or weak signals with greater nuance, aka a non-measurable, non-quantifiable approach, and anticipate possible future. Here's one point that I want to mention, and this could be actually a good question for you in the chat. What is actually the difference between culture foresight and qualitative foresight methods? This is a question that we discussed with Matthias. We didn't necessarily agree on the answer, but we will be very curious to hear your opinion. So this is the definition we're going to work with today. And again, this is very much ongoing process. So what is cultural foresight really? So first, it's a lens to anticipate friction. As Matthias was just mentioning with the picture, it helps us to see why how possible future are not always desirable and welcome. And another thing that is very interesting with cultural foresight is that it's going to capture things that are quite surprising, that are unexpected. And it's also a very good process and framework to help us interrogate how the future is actually received, interpreted, and lived. Looking at the future and at possible, plausible, and preferable future is one thing, but looking at how those futures are received is another. And this is one of the goals of cultural foresight. Another dimension, of course, is that it's very much human-centric. Even in highly data-driven environments, we continue to be humans. We're not rational, we are emotional, we are moody, we are contradictory, and we are rarely predictable. And one thing I want to say to this is that this dimension is unfortunately too often overlooked. And this is why having or using some tools that Culture Foresight offer us is quite interesting to broaden the spectrum of strategic foresight. Then another aspect of culture foresight is that it can be seen as a bridge between the futures that we just talked about and lived reality. A risk of foresight, as we just seen with the picture, is that sometimes it can be too far removed from what people really experience. And this is why we need the human-centric layers. everything that we can learn from what people think, the way they behave is helpful to help to understand tomorrow, but also to shape it. And culture foresight is a way for us also to make things more tangible and relatable, because at the end of the day, we all want that the futures that we are observing and mapping, that they feel relatable to people. At least this is one of my core missions. And one last aspect is that we can see culture foresight as a framework to decode culture adoption. As we already mentioned, culture is very much something that people either that it's something that people, it's very personal, and because it's very personal, they will either resist it, they will either change it, they will ignore it, they will reinterpret it. And this is not something that we can easily capture when we do, like let's say, more basic strategic foresight. And it's very helpful also to see how people use, in that case, technologies, how they embed them into habits and rituals and identities, which is actually the core definition of culture. So this is like the four elements that we identified that really differentiate culture foresight from strategic foresight.
And I think it's interesting, as you can probably already see here, we're kind of moving between on the spectrum between application and identity. You know, you can't really see the two away from each other in the sense of like, what identity personally is as foresight practitioners, as the people we're trying to work with, the clients or the users or whatever you work with, right? And then you have the application of certain tools that are used as a frame for this. So that's why this masterclass is kind of an in-between the two. And that's important to just say. So there are certain behavioral lenses that are kind of steered a little bit by culture, but also by other factors, by our humanity in itself, right? So of course we have certain biological drivers that are steering what we do, very basic instincts. We talk about the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? How we kind of, there are certain things that are very important to us that will, be a driving factor in terms of what we do and how we do things. So, when we move kind of above, a little bit above the basic needs, we're also seeking certain things like, stimulation, or, it can even lead to addiction of certain things that will stimulate parts of the brain. So there are certain behaviors that emerge from these instincts. Then we, of course, also have shared meaning, and these different lenses are, of course, all interconnected, intertwined. It's just to separate a little bit what the different ones are. So, for example, this church here in Denmark, I don't know if you've seen it in many places in the world, but there's a like kind of a reinvigoration of spirituality, of religion in certain places that have been kind of moving away from that. This church is a great example because actually it's also being used for shared meaning in another sense. It's been very popular on TikTok, so a lot of the Chinese tourists are interfering with the different rituals that are existing in the church. So there's a bit of a friction right now happening in those two worlds between the traditions we have and the cultural elements from a local culture perspective, and then someone trying to experience from a different angle, right? So that's a little bit of an interesting friction to talk about. But of course, this is something deeply rooted in us, who we are, who we come from, how we feel connected spiritually and culturally. There are also more systemic things, right? So really behavioral shifts that when tools or systems change in that sense that they can make us do things faster. For example, I think it's a great example how our like cultural mindset has shifted in terms of how we use AI and how it's changing us. And the same time, same happened with social media, right? We might not notice these subtle changes, but over time they will make up a lot of how we think about the world and how we perceive things. So these bigger systems that we're part of, or platforms even, they have an impact also on the way we think about things. Then, of course, technology affordance. It's a bit related to the other one on technology, right? I think the other example is also a little bit how users, like viewers, have become users and creators. So we were all exposed. But this is maybe more about how, it's easier to Because we have technology and it gives us certain possibilities, then we also have a tendency to then use them, right? Because it's stimulating, it's driven based on our convenience, and so on and so forth. And that's why I think, for example, science fiction is such an interesting concept because it's actually driving a lot of the change in the world we see us around now. That's one thing with billionaires taking inspiration from some of these like vivid imagined worlds. But also in the sense that it might be a technology that's changing in the science fiction world, but really what's interesting are the aspects of what it means to our humanity, our, our instincts, our ways of being together and all this. If anyone has seen Project Hail Mary, I think it's not maybe like a culturally rooted thing, more a psychological concept, but how would it be to meet a species that you couldn't, in theory, communicate with, and you have to learn everything from scratch? I think that's an interesting thought experiment to do a little bit with yourself. What would your reaction be? And I can only recommend the book as well. Then, of course, when we talk about the future, there's always this massive amount of hype of certain things. Some things, on the trend curve, they move upwards very fast and they generate a lot of hype and interest and all these things. But the adoption rate is typically a bit slower in the use case, right? We have these innovators that make it seem like everyone is should be experiencing FOMO, that they're behind because they're really at the edge of trying something new out. Whether it be it NFTs or cryptocurrencies or whatever it might be. Some of these things actually then tend to happen over time and turn into a proper thing that's mainstream in society. But of course, there's also a lot of hype we need to kind of separate from the actual signals and the noise. So that's a little bit of interesting, like the futuristic things. Also in terms of some biohacking, people are really trying out new things, but the adoption rate is not always following the speculation there.
And we have actually here a very good example what happens when culture defies tech. So on the top left, you have an article from 2022 saying that Zuckerberg, so Meta CEO and Apple are in a very deep philosophical competition to build the metaverse. And on the bottom right, you have one of the latest news saying that Meta is actually pivoting away from the metaverse and shutting down their platform Horizon World. So in between 4 years, I also put like other screenshots from Reddit and from other articles. But what is interesting here is that it's not because a reality sounds plausible and realistic and desired by certain groups of people that the population and that it becomes mainstream. So here what we see is like the cultural misalignment. Yes, the metaverse, or some part of it was very like promising, a lot of investments, people were buying land, etc., etc. But people, especially after the COVID time, were actually not ready to just dive deep into this new reality and this new way of doing life. So here it's very interesting to see that it's not because things are hyped and people are really enthusiastic and investing a lot of money, energy, and time in it that it's gonna actually happen.
And sometimes we fail to look at people's expectations as well and what they're kind of experiencing already in other aspects, right? So, for example, some a concept that I've heard talks about for many years, and I think is very much real in this age of AI as well, is like liquid expectations. So how expectations from one arena moves over into another one. So, for example, with the metaverse, what we already were seeing, was like a really, really like lovely like highest level graphics and video games and movies and so on, really like high quality. And it's just become better, better over the years. But the metaverse didn't really live up to this promise. So that's one reason why it didn't really seem as an attractive place. And it was also this idea that, hey, maybe we could, make some money. Maybe it will mature over time. Maybe it will become an idea in a different way that will then actually have a mainstream impact. But for now, it's just talking about it. But I think a great example here of expectations is, for example, I've heard of stories of doctors where the patients coming to them saying, "Hey, my ChatGPT has told me that this is what's wrong with me. These are the symptoms. Can you please just prescribe this medicine that is suggested to me?" without even consulting the doctor or anything. And there's this certain expectation of the doctor as a service provider, and not someone who can actually give you advice on what's wrong with you. And I think that's an interesting slippery slope that everyone as an expert concept that kind of slips into like practice when we have this information available at all times that makes us seem like we know it all. And then, of course, trust and legitimacy in that sense, right? So we trust the actors. It could be everyone from influencers to the government, or really the message, the system, right? So there are certain things that make us do things in a certain way if we really trust or believe the messages of what we hear, or can also be more from a top down, being told what to do. And there are, of course, regulation and things to keep us doing certain things because of typically the point is the well-being of the society at large, right? So that's something that's interesting to understand as well. What does that mean, and what does it do when trust breaks? Who do we place our trust in the future? And then finally, I think this is maybe the most interesting one, this resistance. So maybe in some ways our societies become very hyper optimized for certain things, but maybe not for the people in the room. Maybe there are many different counter movements that are moving opposition to some of the mainstream things we're seeing, right? So really like that control or optimization, maybe we need more spirituality. Maybe there's a newfound discovery of maybe psychedelics can be a helpful tool after it's been like kind of been seen as something we don't talk about for many years, right? Like anti-system, we have political movements and so on that have their own groups and own niche environments to operate in that are really driving a lot of effort as well to fight against something in that sense. It's not easy to change behavior. I'm not saying that people should. Sometimes, and most of it happens subconsciously. I think it's not an active choice that we suddenly find ourselves doing something because we trust the government, right? Or in influence. It's not an active decision. Maybe it's more a result of being part of society in that way. But what does it actually take to change behavior in a certain way? So, if you are making the decision, for example, to quit smoking, as the classic example, you might have all the knowledge in the world about how bad smoking is for you. And you have the deep understanding of that, right? And maybe an idea in the future, you could imagine, okay, my lungs would be much better if I didn't smoke. But that's still a long way from actually making sure that you're successful in changing this behavior and building habits. That's something that's really difficult. Even more is difficult alone, but it's even more difficult sometimes for groups of people. So we have this clarity about where we go, understanding what is missing between what we know today and what we kind of want to do, and then actually those interventions that needs to be done to close that gap to make sure we quit smoking, for example. And then of course the ongoing impact. Does I actually feel better? Is there a reason for me to keep going with this? And this is not an easy journey to go on alone, and that's why I think a lot of time a habit doesn't happen consciously. It's really more of a subconscious plane. And of course, there are also different paces of change. So not everything moves super fast. And as you can see here, culture typically, in some aspects of culture, moves quite slowly. And I think this is more on a broader sense of national cultures, for example. It does change and it does emerge out of what's happening, but it's not something that's super fast necessarily in changing on a big scale. We have certain sub themes like fashion or consumption that changes much faster what we want to buy, but the longer term drivers of the bigger frames of culture are longer to change.
One last thing to say before we dive into the tools that we've chosen today to share with you. There are some benefits of cultural foresight. So first, as we already seen in the first part of this masterclass, this idea that we have a really deeper human-centric insight. And I'm pretty sure that now you are convinced why this is very important. It's not only about what makes sense in general, what makes sense for humanity, but it's also how people make sense. And this is actually something very crucial that is not always easy to decode, but something that we need to pay attention to. Another thing that Matthias just mentioned is with culture foresight, we're able to decode or at least map the culture pushbacks. Counter movements, content trends is something that is quite normal. If you look at every phenomenon or most of them in the world, there is always a cultural pushback. The size of it depends a lot, but it's always happening. This is how we keep also actually our culture very healthy, right? So cultural foresight helps us also to have this somewhere in our head in order to anticipate and to anticipate potential changes in behaviors or in narratives. Another thing, if we are very practical and pragmatic, by understanding those narratives, those tension, organizations, and the private sector in general can actually create things that resonate even more with those evolving identities. We now know that this is a huge topic, that brands have difficulty to really connect with what they call their tribes or community, but I'm pretty sure that if they would use more cultural foresight internally or by hiring people like us, they will be able to create innovative processes and things, items that actually really meet needs and are way more aligned than what they do nowadays without implementing too much cultural foresight. And then, of course, it's a competitive advantage, not only because we are in this heavily tech AI driven world, but also because knowing how humans think, behave, what they want, what they don't want, is actually a way to foster trust. And we know how much important this idea of trust is nowadays because it's changing a lot and at a very fast pace. So brands and organizations who are able to look at the future from a human-centric lens will actually make a big difference in the way they do business, but also in the way they connect with their audience. So let's now focus on the cultural foresight tools. We have decided to present 4 of them today. I'm pretty sure there are others out there, but those are the ones that we want to introduce you to today. I'm very curious to know, and this is a question for you in the chat, which ones are you familiar with and which one you aren't familiar with yet? And the reason why we chose those ones is because, as you can see, each of them can be implemented at each step of the foresight process. We're going to discuss that later on. So let's dive into the fringe mapping, Matthias.
Yeah. I just want to add to the point, for the final point on the competitive advantage from Chloe, is that in a world where we have so many gray futures generated by AI, it really adds value to bring flavor and color into the world through human perspectives. I think is maybe a bit overlooked at the moment, but that it just becomes so much more important to get those enriching perspectives into the mix when we have all these different versions that look like variations of the same thing, 50 shades of gray, so to speak. When we have a fringe mapping here, is that basically, if you've heard of horizon scanning, this is a variation of that, you might say. So a little bit of looking specifically at the fringes, not so much at the maybe more obvious signals and trends around us, but more specifically looking at what's outside of like kind of the mainstream discussions in society right now. So we do have AI that's helpful for collecting this mainstream information that's out there and available. But if you want to really understand what's shifting at the edges, we need more human, more interpretive, and more participatory ways of scanning. And as you might see, we have a lot of text on our slides, and we apologize for this, of course, because it's not conducive necessarily, but it's because we're gonna just give you this as a little workbook afterwards, so you can read what everything is about, right? So for kind of scanning the fringe for understanding what's happening, there are many different tools, and you might be familiar with all these, at least some of them, right? Of everything from the wisdom of the crowd using kind of different survey tools, focus groups, getting there, sitting with interviews with users and experts. And of course, you can do that in every type of process. That's not very futuristic and driven, but to really be specifically targeting some of those aspects that we see down here in the Cypher method and in the Verge method of exploring signals. So Cypher is by Amy Webb and her company, where we really try to group these different signals that we're seeing into contradictions, inflection points, what is like the really tipping points that are taking place here, the practices that are emerging, the hacks, like the small things that might have a big impact, the extremes, the things that we might see one person doing in, or in one aspect, but that might be, relevant for the insight we're going to get here. And the rarity is more the black swan events, and the bigger impact things that we don't see every day. And then there's the verge as well. It's more on a human perspective, like how does those changes that we're seeing play out across different domains of the human experience. And this is really where I think cultural foresight plays a role to has a role to play, right? So what does it mean, this signal we're seeing, like AI, for example, and how we define ourselves, how we relate with other people and connect with other people in the same way to people close to us. What we create, what we actually consume, and then what we destroy, what we don't do anymore. And I think these are good, like helpful tools to frame the scan instead of just doing a classic pastel analysis or steep or what you might call it, right? So to really make sure we look at the edges of what's taking place. And of course, when we talk about scanning the fringe, just a quick note on that. There's a difference between the normal use of these tools that ask them what they think, and then they give a response. That's very present and past oriented. And then actually putting them in certain situations and have to respond to that, right? So imagine you lived in a world like this in 10 years from now, where you have this and these things, like a little more vivid and immersive experiences in that way. And of course, the purpose here is to surface different levels of insights than just the ordinary ones that you might get. We can do a horizon scan on any platform or via AI in very matter of seconds, but that's not really the point here. It's really to help some of the shifts that we might be seeing, some of the more subtle things that are moving below the surface, to really bring in the outside in to our perspectives, right? So we need to scan a bit beyond the obvious and trying to actually use these tools like Cypher and Verge to structure our thinking a little bit differently than for normally what we normally do, right? And of course, we also need to interpret those themes, those concepts, those small things we see popping up on the radar.
Okay, let's move on to another tool, the causal layered analysis. That is a Foresight method that was developed by Foresight practitioner and futurist Sohail Inayatullah. And it's very interesting because it helps to unpack any issue through across four layers of understanding. So as you can see here on the left, on the little graphic, there is no, you cannot actually see the first one. So the first one is called litany, which is basically the surface level facts and headlines of a topic. Let's say in that case, I'm going to show you later with an example, but longevity. So what are the facts and headlines about longevity? Then we move to the systemic causes. So what are the underlying structures and drivers? What is actually leading to this becoming an issue? Then something that is actually way more invisible, people's worldview. So from their beliefs to their cultural frame and ideology, we also want to unpack this because this, of course, is impacting the way they think and relate to a topic. And then the last one, which is even more invisible, and this is why it's very interesting, is the stories and the narratives, especially the symbolic one that we tell ourselves and that we believe are true about a certain topic. So why does it matter? Because it matters because first it helps us to go beyond surface level. It's not only about what is happening and why is it happening, like the very obvious, but it's actually invite us and it invites also our audience to go beyond that, to look at how things are constructed through systems, to beliefs, values, and narratives. So it's a bit more like introspective, but very much needed, especially when you are unpacking a topic that is quite complex with your audience. Another thing that I really touched on is the narrative awareness, the fact that with the two last layers, worldview and myth and metaphors, you are able to make the implicit visible. So it's sometimes a bit uncomfortable for people because they're not aware of that, but this is exactly the point. We want to understand why people think that certain things are normal, desirable, while others think it's actually the contrary. And another thing that is very interesting about the CLA tool is that it reframes the capabilities. So instead of simply analyzing something, it's an invitation to reframe. We look at alternatives. It's an invitation to challenge dominant perspective, and also to create a proper space to think about, like new possibilities to emerge. The do's and don'ts that are quite obvious. So of course we are looking for alignment, but also for looking for tensions. Remember, in cultural foresight, what is very interesting is the frontier between alignment and tension. So this is really usually the gaps where we find the insights, but also the blind spots that we can then turn into insights. Another thing is it's very important to work across all four layers. Otherwise, it can feel a bit like superficial. I think it's very interesting to really follow this rhythm from litany, starting with like, okay, what do we know about this topic, to go deep into the conversation and unpack the beliefs and deconstruct the beliefs that we have around an issue. And another thing that is, of course, very important in foresight in general, but even more in cultural foresight, is that words do matter. The way people describe it, they choose words generally on purpose and might not be aware of that. The way they use metaphors, the way they frame their thinking, this is something that we also want to look at. The don'ts, we have to be aware that there are power dynamics. As we know, nothing is neutral in this world. Everything we believe in is shaped by our own experience, but also by external factors like institutions, dominant key players. So it's very important to always respect like people's view, but being aware that where they're coming from. It's not because we go deep that it has to be complicated. Actually, the CLA tool is also very great to help us have a bigger and a better understanding of a topic. And the other thing, as we know, stories evolve just like culture, that is not static. So there is nothing fixed. It's rather the contrary. I'm pretty sure if you do the same causal layered analysis 1 year later with the same persons, you won't arrive to the same results. So we have to keep this in mind and not believe that what we found is like the absolute truth. So here's an example, and I'm just going to go very quickly into it, conscious of time, but you can take a screenshot or look at it later. But here is, if we check the topic of longevity, we start with very basic assumptions. Oh yes, billionaires are investing a lot in lifetime expansion. People are living longer than ever. So this is what everyone knows, what everyone sees. It's quite obvious. Then we look at the systematic cause. Why is that? Well, it's that because people are aging, at least in the West. Or why is that? It's because preventative health, at least in the West, again, is becoming economically necessary and actually quite desirable in terms of growth and progress. So those are like the things that are quite obvious, that are documented. And then if we dive deeper into why longevity is such a topic today, you will have probably some people who will say, if you have more life, then you have more vitality and you are more productive. So this will be like maybe the capitalistic view. People like the techno-futurists would say the body is actually something that we can optimize, that we have to manage. It's a tool and not nothing else. Some people will say, well, health is actually a responsibility. This is why you'll see people, especially Gen Z, taking more health into account and investing a lot in it. So those are like people's worldview, depending on where they are in the world. And then the metaphor and the myths, which is something that is really driving us and really taking us very far, is Yes, the stories that we tell ourselves, the pursuit of youth, for example, of upgrading the human, as we are seeing in the Silicon Valley. So as you can see here, we started with something very basic, and the more we establish trust with the audience, and the more they start to get familiar with their own sense of imagination and cultural lens, we are able to go very, very deep. And then the whole point is to use this to nurture our the entire Foresight project, and then of course the strategic implication. Matthias, you're muted.
Yeah, just a note on causal analysis. I think I also use it like internally for company culture stuff. So recently, I had an Pan-African think tank reach out to me, and they're interested in doing. I offered a pro bono project, and but what I really saw them missing was kind of like an alignment factor because they've been doing amazing work or 1.5 years for developing a new strategy, and I really didn't think I could contribute more in terms of doing like more classic strategic foresight exercises. So what I decided on was more to get a sense of like going into the deeper layers of the organization and kind of trying to use the CLA to offer some sense of common kind of common points, consensus, and where we kind of also diverted from each other and trying to set a new direction through some of these metaphors actually and some different pillars for the strategy. So that was a super interesting case where it was more on an internal culture perspective, which could also be very relevant. If we move to a thing from the future, maybe some of you have tried this. It's more of a game, but I think it can be used in many, like a variety of aspects. I tend to use it more like a prototyping different futures, and it can be a quick one. You can spend a couple hours doing it together with a group for fun, but it can also be done more seriously. The important thing here is really that we like draw different cards, and that gives us a prompt for a future and an object that has to create a certain kind of mood in people when they see this and that future. So, for example, here we have 4 cards drawn. And to grow, it's a growth scenario 30 years from now. We're talking about education. The object is a postcard, so you actually have to make a postcard, and you have to be excited when you receive this postcard, for example, right? So that's a very specific, tangible object and artifact from the future. The interesting thing here is not necessarily the generation process. As you can hear, it's a little bit random. You can steer it more, or you can also let it be completely open. You can have, for example, a focus on longevity as the terrain, and then let everything else be more free. Um, but the interesting thing here is people's response to those artifacts. So one artifact was created in a session I did one time was a passport to the realm of the death. So how people in 200 years from now, so there's a quite far out scenario, could visit where dead people go in essence, and that's different depending on culture and all this, I know, and religion and so on. But they can visit and experience what it is to be more maybe calm when they then return back and get that experience. It might sound completely out there, but it was a super interesting discussion afterwards on what it means to own immortality and existentialism and all this stuff. That really brought like a good sense into the group of what this method can do. And then if we move to the next slide, I actually built through vibe coding, built a platform that's called Prototypes from the Futures. It's borrowing heavily from the original framework that's actually done by Situation Lab, a really inspiring group. They're also offering it. You can print it out for free, but you can also enter this platform and then generate certain things or have the different factors be specific to you and your context. It works decently. I would say it's more of a beta state, but it's a good way to try it out a little bit. So it really this is a way to generate scenarios that are more anchored in certain things. We can kind of it's a little bit like tuning a scenario in certain directions. So we can keep it open or we can be more specific in that way. And those objects we create from this then becomes a way into the wider world in that sense. And make some of the behaviors we do right now and the way we do things become more obvious in a certain way. We have it as kind of a mirror to the present. How will we respond to a potential, maybe a bit abstract future out there? So that's quite interesting as a whole, like a cultural exercise, also depending on who you are and where you're working and so on.
Okay, and our last tool, ethnographic futures research. Um, That is actually quite an interesting one. It was invented by Stanford professor Robert B. Texter in the 70s, I believe. And basically, the idea behind this method is to ask people, real people, to imagine and describe their everyday life in different future scenarios. So, one that is desirable, probable, and possible. And instead of very abstract opinion or projected opinion, we are able to capture first things that feel very real to them, very and also very detailed. And it's interesting because sometimes details can be a bit overwhelming and don't sound like a bit like superficial, but actually those details are quite important when we do culture foresight if we manage to link them with something bigger. So it's basically a one-on-one interview with personas that you have chosen based on their way of life, but also their worldview, and you want to make sure that you have also people in your cohort that are quite opposed in the way of seeing and doing life. And this is how you'll get like the whole spectrum of ideas and scenario through this method. So why does it matter? First, because instead of just mapping what's happening and why it's happening at a very macro level, we are actually capturing how people feel and how they're going to integrate change through their experience. Another thing is, and we already talked about it, it's not because something is feasible and preferable and plausible that it will happen. Like cultural adoption is a big thing to take into consideration when we do foresight. So whether it is like reinterpretation or just social basic acceptance, we need to really, this is something that we can capture through the EFR method. And then, as I already talked about the human reality check. Instead of having concrete, a bit abstract scenario, we are able to create scenarios that are experience-based, that are closer to reality, and this then also facilitates and enables better engagement among stakeholders and supports more informed decision-making process. So instead of having something that no one can really relate to, you're not even sure, the only thing that you have is data that support or not this, you have something that looks a bit more trivial and a bit more anecdotic, but it's actually very useful if you want to connect to your future audience. So very quickly on the do's and don'ts. So it's help us to explore multiple future to create contrast in lived experiences. It's also, and this could be it's actually quite debatable, but we need to acknowledge that subjectivity can be treated as data. And again, this is something that not everyone agrees on, but something that is actually quite central and fundamental in the culture of foresight. And of course, we need to ensure that the narrative depth and specificities, because as you've seen with ethnographic futures research, what we're doing is that we create scenario. Things that we shouldn't do is to avoid superficial data collection, collect generic responses, not really looking into the personas that we're talking to. Having a less like a more random approach than a structured one is actually not welcome here. So here are some examples of questions, but those are just examples. So first, you need to ask the people how they relate to their life now in relation to the topic that you are exploring. So can you describe your life today? This is a good open question where you invite the person to talk about their life and to get to know you and get a sense of trust. Then you can ask them what frustrates them most about how things work today, what gives them hope, really sensing how they relate emotionally to the topic you are addressing. And then you go into the future. Imagine it is 10 years from now, how has this topic evolved in your daily life? Again, you can ask what is frustrating, what is not, what would be your ideal future regarding these topics. So there are like a lot of questions that you can ask, and the thing that we need to keep in mind is that you will have different future scenarios. So one that is for those people preferable, possible, and desirable. And based on that, you then build up your set of questions.
Yeah, just a little bit. That's also part of the discussion in the chat. Of course, it's always great to see some examples. Unfortunately, due to our nature of being consultants, a lot of the work is under NDA, or it's not really showing the process as much as it's showing the outcomes, unfortunately. But to the left here, as a project I did last year about an automotive retail safari. So basically, a brand wanted to understand what would it take to enter the Danish market. And not just now, but also setting themselves up for the next 10 years, right? I think, coming from a cultural lens, it was super interesting to actually go out and visit different the car dealerships and trying to immerse myself in that environment. Being a bit of a mystery shopper is a bit of a different assignment than typically, but also understanding what are the customers looking for, what are the things that might change over the next few years, what are the things that you can see in some of the car dealerships, but not in other ones, right? So really some of these aspects, and together with desk research and trying to imagine, yeah, exactly what it says in the chat, like what a day in the life is of a future consumer, brought these perspectives in. It's like really we went from transaction to transformation. We're trying to transform ourselves as customers in the shop in the futures. We both want trust. We also want to feel certain emotions when we go visit a retail store, and using digital, of course, as a very convenient, seamless experience on the way. The middle example is a project I'm currently doing together with someone called Liberty and then Google, where we're trying to understand. It's a project called Future Report. It's done every year, but now it's moving to Denmark as well. And we're going to do it right very soon, where we're going to have focus groups with the teenagers on their expectations and experiences around being young and the future and technology and all of those things, both a quantitative study, a survey tool in that way of trying to generate information. And I think it's a fairly well done in terms of responsibility for these young people as well. And then also some focus groups where we're trying to have that be a bit of the focus area, right? The futures of this. And then finally to the right is a lab did a few years ago, Democratizing Futures Lab. And, a bunch of entrepreneurs from Eastern European countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and so on. They came to Copenhagen. I also did it last year. And we did a thing from the future in a variation format. So what's the futures of democracy and how can we build certain things that can help us improve our democracies in the futures? So a very live study in that way, and also really on the cultural context. It was interesting to talk about this with these people who are facing like the kind of the existence of the democracy is being threatened, versus like really, normally working in Danish or other international contexts. So super interesting study as well. Good. And we're approaching the end here. Just a little bit about how we then go through each step together, and there will be some time for questions as well. So when we go from cultural to strategic foresight, and of course you can't, and with everything that goes without saying, there's nothing, like hard lines between these different concepts and methods. It's very much part of an all, the whole of anticipating futures, right? But if you had to put things together, you would explore the edges through fringe mapping to really trying to get a sense of those signals and like kind of behaviors to shift to underlying shifts that are not really mainstream yet. So really using that to think outside. Then we would use the CLA to perhaps tackle a few of those topics. So it could be longevity, it could also be something even more specific on a specific new technology or a specific new tool or medicine and so on to really make sure what sits below the surface. Who are we? What are we talking about here? What's the theme? What's the metaphor for this concept here? Um, and a way to then move forward would be to maybe take that theme as the terrain and then use that as the offset for a thing from the future in more like a fast gamified format, and then focus a lot on fast prototyping, building these different artifacts, and then using them to understand our responses to them. What does it make us feel? Does it make us feel uncomfortable? Does it indicate some frictions? Is it plausible? Even could we use this to build up an actual project or product, and so on. And then finally, to really understand like what do these scenarios mean, we can help with the help of ethnography, we can kind of understand the lived experiences of potential future personas. What would a day in the life be of those, and what kind of implications would that surface for what we need to do strategically or for our products and so on. So it's a little bit like the full scale process in short.
Matthias, I'm conscious of time. Shall we jump straightly to the key takeaways and have the 15 minutes for Q&A?
Yeah, I think that's a
There are
good
no
idea.
questions. We can go back to the content. But as already mentioned, but for those who arrived a bit later, we'll share the workbook. So everything that we won't cover today will be in the workbook for you to.
And there's a lot of text on the last slide, so I think it gives a good indication of what we try to say. Hmm? Yeah,
So
so in terms of the takeaways, I think foresight and whatever you kind of foresight exercise you do, it always starts with finding the right question, right? So we spend our time kind of focused on what we think is important and relevant, and so now and the future. But of course, it's exploration as well. So we look into not just sticking with that, but really exploring what is different versions of that, and looking at the edges as well for what's out there. And I think it's important to say as well, as Chloe has mentioned, that there are no neutral view of the futures. It's very culturally contingent how we view the futures and personal as well. So there's something to take into consideration when we do a process and what we value and take for granted and so on.
And as we've seen today, another key takeaway here is that human realities are the ultimate stress test. And I'm going to repeat myself, but everything that is possible, probable, or that is pushed by certain groups in the world is not always desirable. So it's very important. And this is, again, like the main focus of cultural foresight is to ground future in lived and realistic life experiences. Another thing that is quite important to take away is that the weak signals that we all love to track actually in the context of cultural foresight emerge at the edges, and this is why it's important to also cultivate a network that goes beyond the traditional network that we have. So, for example, in my case with longevity, of course, I'm talking to the scientists, the one that are more like institutional, established, but I have also deep connection to people working in the frontier tech segment, or who are like truly biohacker, or people who don't want to die, or people who want to, have themselves cryogenized. So it's very important to go out there, remember to go out of our cultural bubble and to cultivate a network of those what we could call early adopters and visionaries of this world, because this is where change happens early, and it helps us to be a bit ahead of our time and also of our competitors. And then last but not least, depth creates differentiation. This is why we do this work. This is why we believe that cultural foresight is important in the foresight discipline. Decoding beliefs, narratives, meanings, habits, rituals is actually a strategic advantage. It's something that takes time, that is subjective, as we already discussed, but something that we believe is a good advantage in the world we live in. So thank you so much for your attention and for being here. And we are now going to open the Q&A. Amy, do you have?
Yes, I've been gathering them, and then actually some of them might have been organically answered by you. So I've taken everybody's names. So Maha, you had asked, I'm wondering if by culture you mean corporate culture or country community culture. Did you feel like that was clear in the end, or do you want to ask that?
No, that was answered in the beginning. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
But great question, an important one.
No, I was just been doing research on cultural innovation, and we had this huge clash. And a lot of the content coming up was all around like corporate cultural innovation and not a lot of focus on actual humans, like outside of work.
Are there any other questions you would like to ask? I think maybe I'll do that. The question that you asked, if it got answered, and then if you have another question. Do you have another question?
I just have the last question that I posted around when you're doing ethnographic research or even some of the other but especially there, I think, do you ever encounter a clash between what people believe they're about versus what they really are? So if they say, oh yeah, we believe, for example, in equality, but then actually in their practice, you feel like that they're not, that's not really what they believe, but they believe it's the right thing to say.
I mean, you have to. It's not always obvious. And I guess this comes also with experience, where you're able to really make the difference between what people say and how they really act. And that most of us don't walk the talk. And again, this is like part of being a human being. So, yes, we do, or at least I do. But I'm also very aware that this comes with experience, and this comes also with it's not always detectable, but when it is, I think it's important to A, dive deeper into it, and B, mark this as a gap. And also, again, this leads back to this idea of subjectivity. It's yeah, and sometimes people are not even aware that they're not walking the talk. So yeah, it's
Chloe, can I give an example of that? There was once a LinkedIn post, and it was from an ethnographic researcher. And this woman had said, I'm a minimalist. And then he went in her home, and there was 50 bottles of shampoo around her bathroom. So like what we say and think we are, and then what we are. So lived reality and being in the place of lived reality, that's the gift. And just a survey doesn't always get that. You kind of need a witness. But I wish I took the screenshot because it was such this beautiful of like what we think we are versus what we say. Next questions were from Ilya. Apologies if I've said this wrong. How does it relate to worldview in potential futures? I have an understanding that our values shape values that will translate into worldviews, but I'm curious to hear your experience. And Ilya, if that question feels like I've not captured what you've written, please share if you're still here.
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you. No, I think it's been answered actually in the CLA analysis, right? So, but I do have another question, and I think it's also within the ethnographic research that you say. Because we actually had a debate, we also do innovation, and there we always use a day in the life, but in a different stage. So I was surprised here also, and I really love the exercise. So basically twofold. If you put it forward, are people today actually able to envision a future 10 years from now? I mean, with all that's going on. And why is it in the strategize phase and not maybe earlier for understanding?
Matthias, you're muted.
Yeah, so I think it's really throughout the process. Of course, like we have kind of set it up as a one way you can kind of configure these steps. So I don't think it has to be the certain way. You can also use causal layer analysis to scan for different signals you're seeing, right? So this is one suggestion of how you can do it. Having the personas at the end. I think, with the lived realities, we need to also set ourselves free, but it's difficult to set ourselves free from the lived realities if we don't understand those already, right? And how people perceive things, because that is the only image we can give is what we think we know and how we think we see the world. I think people have a hard time in general of imagining world 10 years from now. It helps if you bring like what happened 10 years ago, and I kind of look forward, what did you actually think would happen, to get a bit of a reference point for how people think. But of course, their projections will be based on what they ate for lunch, or what they were doing and what they're doing for work right now, and which state of mind they're in. If they're, let's say we're doing this focal group of teenagers, if they're 16, right, and then they project themselves 10 years ahead, there will there'll be some constants, but also things that are changing. So I think it's very much deducing some of those things that we can pick up, and it's a tricky exercise because it's both a little bit of intuition and empathy, and not completely analytical in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll bring it in again. Just try and experiment with
Yes,
it.
please
Thank you so
do.
much. Yeah.
One thing I would like to add also, yes, it might be a bit more difficult to project ourselves in 10 years, given the current context, but actually, for me, the main reason that people might feel unable to that is because they're not relating or connecting enough to their imagination. They don't let themselves actually think about that. Of course, it always depends on where you are in the world. If you are like in a, in a war zone, it might be difficult. But at the same time, as we've seen in some literature from the Second World War, this is actually something that could also help you stay alive, like in the most literal sense. So maybe it's not only like contextual, but also related to imagination. And maybe on top of that, we have a imagination crisis. And we as Foresight practitioner, we want to help people connect again to their imagination through our work.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And I also love the question, what you say, what gives you hope? I really love that, but thank you.
I see a hand. So, Julia, do you want to ask your question? Then I'll go back to questions.
I have a question. So that's very practical. So I think there are a lot of potential multiplicators of cultural foresight in this room. And what would be your wish, Chloe and Matthias, when we step out of this masterclass now and bring it to our environment setups? And where could we possibly start with this movement? And I think it's a movement also.
That's nice. Yes, we saw in the slide I showed on knowledge doesn't equal behavior. I know it can be there could be a lot of good intentions, and I hope you all have that. I think it's like trying to do it in the smallest sense and to begin with. Always the first step is the most difficult one, and then like maintaining some consistency. And I think my advice to everyone is experiment. I think that's no matter which audience I'm speaking to about, like it doesn't matter which thing, but it's like try things out and see if it works for you. Find your own way in it. Just experiment and try different things out, and then trying to see if you can include it in your process in some way or form. Maybe it's very, very small, but it can potentially have big impacts on how you do things.
Yes, I agree with everything that you just said, Matthias. And I would add that it might be a movement, but it's also definitely a battle. So I think now, or hopefully you have more arguments when your manager comes and say, well, subjectivity is not something that we can work with. This is a loss of time, etc. To work with more human-centric insights when we have so much data. So our hope, I guess, is also for you to have enough arguments to actually tell him or her, well, wait a second, I have here some things to say, and let's try something different, and let's do things differently. What we've been doing is maybe not working the way we want, or we've been having issues with our human centricity. So yeah, this is one of our hopes, I guess. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
I think Per may have stepped out, but if you are here, there's a few questions you could ask. If not, Emma, you had a question. Any books related to this topic you could recommend? And some people shared, but Matthias and Chloe, do you have any books or Substacks or things that come to mind?
Well, I would encourage to now this is a bit of a plug as well to look into Culture Connectors, of course, which we're part of, which is a great network and community of people doing this type of work, more insight related, but still also with a foresight lens. I think there's a lot of great movement and dynamic involvement in this group, and both in different countries, but also in different contexts of themes and so on. I've been recommended the book Imaginable by Jane McGonigal. Maybe many of you have read that book, and that's how you found how we found foresight and futures. But I've heard that's supposedly like one of the really great books on how to do these things differently, on simulations and involving people and bringing their imagination into life. So that's a big recommendation from here, at least from a second-hand source, I must say. But yeah, I can't be recommended a book 20 times without it being really good. That's what I'm thinking.
Amazing. Thank you. It would be great to see case studies we couldn't share. Bass had a question, how cultural foresight is different from behavioral design. Bass, do you want to ask that question? Was it answered, or do you have any further questions you'd like to know? And you might not be here still, but I think it's a question that others might have too, if you want to answer that one.
Well, I think behavioral design is part of cultural foresight, and the behavioral design is very much about the action of changing people's behavior, where I think the cultural foresight is maybe more on anticipating what could happen in terms of behavior. So they're related, but not directly the same field. But it's a good question. I think we need to focus much more on behavioral science as well. Yeah.
Agree.
And then Maha, your question was answered. Lakashmi, if you want to ask this, it was fringe signals, can they be tracked through secondary research, and how reliable is secondary research for fringe signals? And then please join.
Sure. Thanks for taking the question. So the question that I really had was when when I was actually talking to an insights team the other day, and we were talking about parenting. And in India, essentially, the parenting is very high pressure, and people are very merit focused when it comes to children. And my recommendation was that when you look at the fringe areas, which was got from secondary research, saying that there is a lot of focus on mental health and the way parents are parenting the children today. It's not so much about helicopter parenting. So the insights team, that person really turned around and said, but when we actually talk to the parents, they say that these kids have to go out and operate in the world, which is extremely competitive. So when I make such a recommendation to them, that's not really going to work for them. But the fringe signals. So they asked me, where did you get this information? So I said that this was secondary research. I haven't really spoken to parents, but I'm sure if I do speak, this is some feedback which I will get from lived experiences. I did not convince them too much. So especially because the data was secondary, so I really wanted to know, because I believe that this is an important narrative and it should have been looked at, but I was not able to convince them because it's secondary data. So that's the reason for my question.
I would say I agree with you. It's a mix of methods. First, because companies and clients do not always have the budget for first-hand
Exactly.
research, because they're more expensive. And secondly, what secondary hand research helps you to do is to really get in touch with worlds that you don't know, and then on top of that you can add like a really for example through ethnographic futures research experience. So for me it's actually a good mix. And in the world we live in, I mean, when I started doing back then, it was way more like trend forecasting, but there was no social media or anything like that. So people would travel the world to spot those signals, like this is like
Right.
this world doesn't exist anymore. So what we do right now is we travel the World Wide Web. So I would definitely say that the ideal case is to combine both when there is enough budget, because one helps you to get wide and the other one helps you to get deep, and we need both perspectives.
That helps. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Good luck with your client.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
That was it for written questions, so the floor is open.
Amazing questions. Matthias, is there anything that you'd like to add, or someone just unmuted themselves? I don't have the...
I can only recommend going out and seeing things in real life. Because of all the information we have constantly, it's completely overwhelming the amount we have, which is great in many ways. We have, I imagine you told someone 30 years ago that they would have access to so much information, right? They would be completely like awestruck, like, whoa, this is crazy. But still, it also gives us an expectation that we can find out everything through that. But a lot of it is just, hidden deep. And sometimes it helps to get out of your context. Actually, one of the things we provide and anticipate are these futures field trips that takes people out of their context. And, sometimes we need to see things for ourselves. We can't just read about what they mean. So I think that's the physical component. The human component just becomes much more important as we see the amount of information like exponentially increase out there.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Amazing. All right. Well, then I think all that's left to say is thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really an interesting and explorative process as well. We learned a lot from doing this process and working with these tools ourselves. And we hope to create a bit of a movement, as Julia referred to. I think that will be a great outcome of this, that you are inspired to pursue working with some of these tools yourself and experiment none the least.
Yes, and thank you for your engagement as well. And also thank you, Amy, for joining us and keeping the chat very active and alive. And yes, I can only second what Matthias just said. I think it's all about the experimentation and knowing that it's not an easy road, but it's definitely an interesting one. And good luck with that and keep us posted.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. Super engaging, very
Yeah,
interesting.
super. Yeah.
Thank you for your words, and we see you on the other side.
Yeah, take care.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.